Mind the loose stone at the head of the gallery, the Duke of Brancliffe said, without turning his head, or you will do to yourself what a French shell could not do to me, and break your fool neck upon my floor. He did not expect the young woman to answer. He expected, as he always expected now, silence and the small held breath of pity, the shuffle of a servant edging away from the chair with the great wheels, the averted eyes that had become the whole of his commerce with the living. Corwin, 5th Duke of Brancliffe, master of 9,000 acres and of a body that would carry him no further than the width of a wheeled chair could roll, had grown accustomed to being spoken about and rarely spoken to. So the voice that came back to him out of the dim of the long gallery, breathless and unafraid and threaded with something that might almost have been laughter, struck him like cold water thrown in a fever. "Then it is fortunate," she said, "that I have already found the loose stone, your grace, for I found it with my ankle 3 steps ago, and I am at this moment engaged in not breaking my neck, which is harder than it sounds." There was a scrape, a small cry, the ruinous soft collapse of muslin and a woman's weight, and before Corwin could so much as set his hands to the rims of his wheels, she came down out of the shadow, like a felled sapling, and half into his lap, one hand flung against his chest, the other clutching a fallen candle branch. Her hair coming loose across his shoulder, and her face, startled, mortified, wildly close, a hand's breadth from his own. For a long moment neither of them moved. He had not, in 3 years, been so near a warm and living thing. He had been lifted and turned and washed by his manservant Halloway, with the impersonal gentleness one gives to furniture. He had been prodded by physicians who spoke of him in the third person while their hands were still upon him. But this was different. This was a young woman's whole startled weight against him, her breath quick at his collarbone, her fingers spread over the plain black of his coat as though she felt his heart beat and was surprised to find it beating at all. He smelled wood smoke and cheap lavender water and the honest smell of rain in wool, and under it all the frightened warmth of her, and something in his chest that he had carefully let die stirred like a coal turned over. Then it did what such things always did. It flared into anger, 'cause anger was the only fire he had allowed himself to keep. "Get up," he said. "I am trying." She had got a knee against the wheel and was pushing herself back, all elbows and apology, her cheeks scarlet in the light of the one candle that had survived the fall. "I am so very sorry, your grace, I did not. The housekeeper said the east gallery, and it was dark, and I could not find I did not know you would be here. In the dark, sitting in the dark. I am generally to be found where they leave me," Corwin said. "In the dark, in the cold. Wherever is furthest from anyone who might be inconvenienced by the sight of me. You have discovered the ducal habit in a single evening, which is more than my aunt managed in 40 years. He got his hands to the rims and rolled himself back from her a foot, out of the ruined intimacy of the fall. And the small ordinary act of doing it, of moving himself, of not being moved, steadied him. "Who are you, and why are you creeping about my house in the dark with a candle you cannot keep alight?" She had regained her feet. She stood before him now, and he made himself look at her fully, because it was one of the few cruelties still available to him, to look at people until they looked away, until they remembered what he was and fled. She was young, perhaps 22, and not beautiful in the way the word was used in the drawing-rooms of the county. She was too tall, and her face was too frank, and her gown was 3 seasons of any fashion, and had been turned and mended at the cuffs by a hand that was careful but not skilled. Her eyes were grey and very steady. She did not look away. "I am Rena Fairbairn, your grace," she said. "I have come to be companion to the dowager, to your mother, that is. I arrived this evening on the mail, and the coachman would not bring me nearer than the lodge, so I walked up in the rain. And I was told to wait in the small parlour, and then I was told the dowager had retired, and I should present myself to the housekeeper in the east wing, and I took a wrong turning, and here I am." She drew a breath. "In your lap. I do beg your pardon for that most of all. You are mother's new companion." He let the words fall flat. "The last one lasted 11 days, the one before her a fortnight. My mother is a difficult woman, Miss Fairbairn, and I am a difficult son, and this is a difficult house, and you have arrived in the rain to a place that will use you up and turn you out, and you have begun by falling into the lap of its worst inhabitant. I would advise you to go back to the lodge and wait for the morning mail and go home, but I imagine you have no home to go to, or you would not be here." He watched the barb go in. He was practiced at it. 3 years alone with his own bitterness had made him a fine marksman of the cruel truth, the small precise thing that would make a person flinch and remember their own smallness. It was, he had found, the surest way to be left alone. But she did not flinch. She tipped her head a little, as though he were a book in an unfamiliar language and she meant to learn it, and she said, quite gently, "No, Your Grace, I have no home to go to. My father was a clergyman with more books than living, and he died in the spring, and the living went to a stranger, and I have exactly what you see, and £11 4 and the promise of £30 a year to sit with a lady I have not met. So you are quite right. And it was not kind of you to say, and I thank you for it anyway, because at least you have told me the truth of the place, which no one else has troubled to do." She bent then, and gathered up the fallen candle branch, and with a coolness that astonished him she took the one live flame and lit a second candle from it, and a third, so that the pool of light widened and steadied around them both. "There," she said. "Now we can at least see one another while we are unhappy." Corwin found that he had nothing to say. This had not happened to him in 3 years either. She was looking at him now, really looking, not the sliding sidelong glance of servants and the sick visitors and his own mother, but a level, curious, unafraid regard, and he understood with a strange lurch that she was seeing him. The blanket over the ruined legs that no longer answered him, the broad shoulders that had been a cavalry officer's and were now only useful for hauling himself from bed to chair. The lines that pain had cut into a face that was still, he had been told once, a handsome one, before the war, and the wall, and the horse that came down on top of him in the smoke at a place whose name he would not say aloud. She saw all of it, and she did not arrange her face into the careful blankness of pity, and she did not brighten it into the dreadful cheerfulness of the nurse. She simply looked at him as though he were a man, which is to say, as though he were a person and not a misfortune, and it was so long since anyone had done that Corwin felt it in his throat like a swallowed stone. "Well," he said at last, roughly, because roughness was armor and he needed it. "You have found the east wing. It is that way. Mind the stone. If Mrs. Pettifer has retired, wake her. She is paid to be woken. And Miss Fairburn, Your Grace." He meant to say something cutting. He had a dozen ready. He found him saying instead, "There is a step down at the end of the gallery that the candles will not show you. 2 hands' breadth, on your left. Do not break your neck on it. I have grown weary of physicians in this house, and would not have another sent for on your account." She smiled. It was not a large smile, and it was not a bright one, and it did not last long, but it changed her whole plain face, and it was aimed directly at him, and he had forgotten, he had genuinely and completely forgotten, in the long grey years of being pitied, what it was to have a young woman smile at him as though he had done something kind. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said. "I shall mind the step. Good night." And she went, carrying her borrowed light, her wet hem darkening the parquet, and the small ordinary click of the far door closing behind her left Corwin alone again in the great gallery with 2 candles she had lit for him and the memory of a warmth against his chest. He sat a long while. The rain came harder against the tall black windows. Somewhere below a clock told the half-hour, and then the hour, and still he did not ring for Halloway to take him to his rooms. He looked at the 2 candles she had lit and could not put them out. It had been 3 years since a shell brought down a French wall, and the wall brought down his horse, and the horse came down on him, and the surgeons in the field hospital had said he would not live, and then, when he lived, had said he would never walk, and had been right, and had gone away. It had been 3 years since his betrothed, Lady Cassandra Vere, who had loved a duke and a dancing partner and an eventual dukedom, and who had discovered she did not love a broken man in a chair, had written him a letter of great feeling, and married his cousin's friend within the 12-month. It had been 3 years since he had learned that the world's kindness to a wounded man is a kind of burial, that they lower their voices and their eyes and put you gently away in the ground of their pity while you are still, God help you, alive to feel the earth come down. He had decided, somewhere in those 3 years, to oblige them. If they wished to bury him, he would lie still. He had dismissed his friends, quarrelled with his heir, driven off his mother's companions, snapped the neck of every kindness offered him, because a man who is being buried alive has only one dignity left, and that is to refuse to be comfortable in the grave. And now a clergyman's penniless daughter had fallen into his lap out of the dark, and lit him 2 candles, and looked at him like a man fool. Corwin said aloud to himself, to the gallery, to the rain, "Old fool, she will be gone in 11 days like the rest." But he did not believe it quite, even as he said it, and that frightened him more than the fall had, more than the near warmth of her, more than anything that had come to him in 3 years of the dark. Because to believe she might stay was to want her to stay, and to want was to hope, and hope was the one wound he had sworn he would never let anyone open in him again. He rolled himself at last to the bell-pull and rang for Holloway, and when the old man came with the lamp and the careful, downcast, dutiful face that Corwin had grown to hate, the Duke of Brancliffe said only, "The new companion, Miss Fairburn, see that her room has a fire." It was raining, and she walked up from the lodge, and no one thought to send the cart. Holloway's careful face did a small astonished thing and then smoothed itself. "Yes, your grace," he said. "At once, your grace," and, gathering the wheeled chair to turn it, he added very low, in the voice of a man who had served the boy before he served the ruin, "It is good to hear you think of someone's fire but your own, Master Corwin." "Do not," said the Duke, "grow sentimental, Holloway. I merely dislike being disturbed by strangers dying of chill in my galleries. Take me up, and leave the candles." She lit them. Let them burn out on their own. In the morning Corwin told himself he had forgotten her, and knew he lied. He kept a strict order to his days, the order of a man who has decided that if the world will not give him a life it must at least give him a routine, which is the poor cousin of a life and takes up nearly as much room. Holloway came at 7, and there was the long, humiliating, necessary business of being made ready, which Corwin bore in silence with his jaw set and his eyes on the middle distance, refusing to be helpless even while he was being helped. He breakfasted alone at the small table in his study, from which he could see the beech avenue and the deer moving under it in the grey morning. He read the newspapers 3 days old and the estate ledgers, for whatever else the world had taken from him it had not taken his intelligence. And he ran Cliff by post and by the trembling reports of a steward who feared him, ran it well, better than his father had, though no one said so, because a man in a chair is assumed to be a man in a fog. At 11 his mother sent word that she would receive him. The Dowager Duchess of Brancliffe kept to the south apartments, a suite of rooms hung in faded rose, where she sat among the miniatures of the dead and conducted a long and elegant war against the fact of her son's condition by the simple expedient of never mentioning it. She had loved him as a boy. Corwin remembered that she had loved him. He could reconstruct it as one reconstructs a country one has emigrated from. But she had loved the boy who would be a duke and a soldier and would give her grandchildren and a place at the head of the county, and when the war sent her back a man in a chair she had been unable to find, in all her considerable stock of feeling, the particular feeling that was required. So she had settled on a brittle brightness, a determined blindness, that Corwin found harder to bear than open grief would have been. She spoke to him of the neighbours' engagements and the price of coal and the sermons of the new rector, and she never once looked below his collar, as though his legs were an indelicacy, a thing a lady did not see. "You have engaged a new companion," Corwin said, when the coal and the sermons were exhausted. "I have engaged nothing," said the Dowager, with a little laugh. "My cousin Sabine sent her. A clergyman's orphan, I understand, quite penniless. But Sabine says she reads aloud beautifully and is not tiresome, and one cannot go on forever without someone to read the sermons to, my eyes being what they are. I have not yet seen her. She is to come at noon. I confess I do not expect her to last. They none of them last, Corwin. The house is too quiet for young women. They want dancing." And she looked at him then, just for an instant, with a flicker of something real and terrible before the brightness came down again. Because dancing was a word that should not have been said, and she had said it. And they both heard the daughter-in-law that never was and the ballroom that never would be, and the flicker died and she said, "More tea?" "No," said Corwin. "I thank you. I will leave you to receive her." He did not leave. He had Holloway wheel him only as far as the Anne room, and there, behind the half-open door, in a shame he despised in himself, the Duke of Brancliffe sat and listened for the companion, She came at noon. He heard the light, quick step he had heard in the gallery. She walked, he thought, like someone who had somewhere to be and was glad of it, and he heard her give her name to the maid, and then he heard the door and his mother's brittle voice, and then, over the course of the next hour, he heard something he had not heard in the South apartments in 3 years. He heard his mother laugh, not the little social laugh, the ha of the drawing room, a real laugh surprised out of her, twice, 3 times. He could not always make out the words. Miss Fairbairn read a psalm, and then at the dowager's evident complaint, read a novel instead, and read it, Corwin gathered, with such spirit and such wicked accuracy in the voices of the foolish characters that the old woman was betrayed into merriment against her will, and then they talked. His mother asked about her father, and Miss Fairbairn answered plainly and without the whine of the professionally pitiable, and told some small dry story of a country parish that made the dowager laugh a 4th time, and Corwin, in the anteroom, in the chair, with his hands white on the rims, found that his own mouth had done something strange and unfamiliar, and he put his hand up and discovered he was smiling and stopped. "Take me away," he said to Halloway low. "Now, before she comes out." He was not quick enough. As Halloway turned the chair, the inner door opened, and Miss Fairbairn came through it with a book under her arm and stopped dead at the sight of him, and Corwin, caught, cornered, exposed in the act of eavesdropping upon his own mother's happiness like a beggar at a lit window, felt the blood come up into his face and hated her for seeing it. But she only said, as though it were the most natural thing in the world for a duke to be sitting in his mother's anteroom at noon, "Good morning, your grace." Or afternoon, "I have quite lost the hour, your mother is very entertaining. Did you know she once put a frog in the bishop's mitre? She was 9. I do not think the bishop ever forgave her," and she smiled the small smile again, and dipped him a curtsy that was neither servile nor mocking but only correct, and went past him toward the east wing, and left him there with his shame turning, in the warmth of her passing, into something that was almost relief. She had not asked how he did. She had not lowered her voice. She had not looked at the chair. She had told him a story about a frog and gone about her business, and it was the kindest thing anyone had done for him in 3 years, and she had done it without appearing to try, and Corwin sat in the anteroom for some minutes after she had gone, undone by a frog. She lasted more than 11 days. He watched her without seeming to. It became, though he would not have owned it, the chief occupation of his days, threaded in among the ledgers and the newspapers 3 days old. He learned her habits as a man learns the weather of a new country. She rose early and walked out before breakfast in all weathers, coming back with her hem wet and her cheeks stung red and a handful of whatever the season offered, the last brown chrysanthemums, a spray of holly, once a bird's abandoned nest that she set upon his mother's windowsill, and that the dowager astonishingly kept. She read to his mother for 2 hours in the morning and again after dinner. She wrote the dowager's letters and endured the dowager's tempers, of which there were many, for the old woman was proud and frightened and cruel by turns, and Corwin heard, through walls, how Miss Fairbairn met the cruelty, not with the professional flinch of a dependent, but with a level patience that neither yielded nor struck back, that simply waited and outlasted, and forgave without ever once saying the word. And she began, by small degrees, to appear where he was. He could not have said how it started. He knew only that where before his study door had been a border no one crossed uninvited, now, once or twice a week, there came the light, quick knock, and she would put her head in with some small excuse, a book she thought might interest him, a question about a word in the dowager's letter, a report that the North Beach had come down in the wind, and did he know? And she would stay at first for a minute, then for 5, then for the better part of an hour, standing at the window or, when he did not send her away, taking the chair across from him uninvited, as though it were the ordinary right of one person to sit with another. She talked to him. That was the whole of the miracle and the whole of the strangeness of it. She talked to him about ordinary things, the frost and the deer and a foolish thing the second footman had said, and she asked his opinion and argued with it, and once, when he said something bitter about a neighbour who had cut him in the road, she said, without heat, "That was not the neighbour being cruel, your grace. That was the neighbour being a coward, which is different, and less flattering to him and to you." He did not know what to say, so he said nothing, and men who say nothing hate the person who made them feel it. You frighten them. It is easier to frighten a man than to bear his pity. I have watched you do it, but it costs you the road, and the road is not so wide that you can afford to lose stretches of it. Corwin stared at her. No one in 3 years had told him what he was doing. They had only borne it. You presume a great deal, Miss Fairburn, he said. For a woman paid £30 a year to read my mother her sermons. I do, she agreed. It is one of my few luxuries. I cannot afford silk or a subscription to the lending library, but I can afford to say true things, because I have already lost everything a true thing might cost me. And there is a great freedom in that, Your Grace, which I recommend to you, for you are in the same fortunate condition and do not seem to have noticed. And she rose and gathered her book and left him before he could decide whether to be angry, which he was learning was a habit of hers and a wise one. That night Corwin did not sleep. He lay in the dark of the great tester bed that Holloway must lift him into and out of. And he thought about the freedom of a person who has already lost everything, and he understood slowly, painfully, like feeling returning to a limb long numb, that he had been using his loss as a wall and she was using hers as a door. He had made his ruin into a fortress from which he could not be reached. She had made her ruin into a strange bright honesty by which she reached everyone. Same wound, opposite architecture. He did not know yet that he was falling. Falling was not a thing he believed his body could do any longer, in any sense. He knew only that the days had colour in them now that had not been there since the smoke and the wall, and that the colour arrived at 11 when she read to his mother and stayed until she went up at night. And that on the 2 afternoons a week, she did not come to his study. He was ill-tempered with Holloway and could not settle to the ledgers, and that this was absurd, and that he could not stop it. Winter came down hard over Brantcliffe. The lake froze. The deer came close to the house for the hay the keepers put out. The roads grew bad and then impassable, and the great cold house drew in upon itself, and in the drawn-in warmth of it, without either of them naming a single thing, the wounded duke and the clergyman's orphan fell into the habit of one another. It could not last, of course. Corwin knew that even at the height of it, even on the good afternoons when she sat in the window seat of his study with the snowlight on her plain frank face and read him a passage from some book of travels and argued with him about whether a man could be happy in a place he had not chosen. He knew that the world which had buried him would not permit him this small warm secret disenchantment. The world had plans for Brantcliffe that did not include a penniless companion warming its master back to life. He knew it, and he told himself he had steeled himself for it, and he had not at all. And when the world arrived, as it did in February, in a fine travelling carriage bearing a crest he knew too well, it took him, for all his armour, entirely by the throat. There was a night, in the deep of that first winter, that Corwin came afterward to think of as the night the wall he had built around himself first truly cracked, and he could never think of it without a strange mingling of shame and gratitude. For it was the night she saw him at his worst and did not run. It was the anniversary. He had not told her, he had told no one. He did not keep it as other men keep such days, with a black band and a moment of pious remembrance, but as a wound keeps its own calendar in the body. A certain slant of winter light and a certain smell of wood smoke and gunpowder frost bringing it all up out of the ground where he had buried it, the day the wall came down, 3 years to the night. And Corwin, who had learned to manage his grief the way a man manages a chronic pain, by never once looking at it directly, found that on this night of all nights the management failed him. And he sat alone in his study long after the house had gone to bed with the decanter at his elbow, and the fire dying, and the whole black weight of what he had lost pressing down on him like the horse in the smoke. And he did what he had not permitted himself to do in a long while. He pitied himself. Thoroughly and bitterly and in the dark, she found him there. She had come down for a book she had left, or so she said, though Corwin came to suspect that Holloway, who missed nothing, had said a quiet word. And she found the Duke of Brantcliffe with the fire out and the decanter low and his face in such a state as he had let no living soul see, and she did not exclaim, and she did not withdraw, and she did not ring for anyone. She came in and shut the door, and knelt and built the fire back up with her own hands, and then she sat down on the floor by his chair, not in the other chair, on the floor, by the wheel, close, and she said nothing at all for a long time, and Corwin, who had been braced for the intolerable kindnesses, the theirs and the you must not dwells, found that her silence undid him where 100 kindnesses could not have. It is the anniversary, he said at last into the dark, because to say it to her was suddenly easier than not saying it. 3 years tonight. The wall. I do not speak of it. I have never spoken of it. Do you know why they call me the Mad Duke of Brancliffe? 'Cause I woke in the field hospital, and they told me my legs were dead, and I did not weep or rage or pray. I only asked quite calmly for my pistols, and when they would not bring them I understood. Very calmly, you understand, very reasonably, that they meant me to live like this, and I have never quite forgiven any of them for it, the surgeons, the world god, myself. I have spent 3 years, Renner, being reasonable about the fact that I wish I had died in the smoke with my horse. Now you know the worst of me. Now you may go, and I shall not blame you, and I shall have the answer at last to the question I have carried 3 years, which is whether a person can love a man who wishes he were dead. She was quiet a moment. The fire she had built cracked and settled. And then she said in her plain grey voice, not gently, not pityingly, but with a kind of steady fierceness he had never heard in her before, I buried my father in the spring. I sat by him 3 nights while he went. And at the end, when the pain was very bad, he wished he were dead too, and said so, and I did not love him 1 grain the less for it, and I do not think a wish to be out of pain is the same as a wish not to have lived. You did not wish you had never lived, Corwin. You wished you had died whole rather than lived broken, and that is not madness. That is only grief that has not been allowed to finish. Grief that is not allowed to finish turns to stone, and a man carries the stone for years, and the world calls the stone his character and steps around it. But it is not your character. It is only unfinished grief, and I am not afraid of it, and I am not going anywhere, and I will sit here on this floor by this fire until it is finished, if it takes all night, or all the year, or all the years I have. So do not ask me whether a person can love a man who wishes he were dead. Ask me the true question, which is whether you can bear to be loved by one who knows the worst of you and stays. That is the harder question, and it is yours to answer, not mine. And Corwin found he had no answer. Only the thing rising in his throat again, the swallowed stone, and this time he did not fight it, and this time on the anniversary of the wall, in the small hours, with the fire she had built burning up warm and steady, the Duke of Brancliffe let the grief begin, at long last, to finish. Not all in a night, for such grief does not finish in a night, but to begin, and she sat on the floor by his wheel and kept the fire and did not leave, and somewhere near the dawn he slept in the chair, worn out with the unaccustomed labour of being comforted, and woke to find she had put his own travelling rug over him and gone quietly up before the house should wake and find them, to save his pride the servants' talk, and that small thoughtfulness, that guarding of a pride she might so easily have let the household trample, told him more of what she was than all her plain brave words, and he lay in the chair in the grey dawn light and knew, with a certainty that frightened and steadied him at once, that if this woman ever left him, it would not be the county that killed him, nor his cousin, nor the wound, but the plain ordinary loss of the one person who had ever knelt on his floor and kept his fire and stayed. After that night the winter changed for them both, though nothing in the house was spoken of. She came to the study more often, and stayed later, and the boundary that had been a border became a room they shared. He told her things he had told no one of the war, and the men he had led, and the ones he had lost, of his boyhood at Brancliffe. The pony and the trout stream and the folly on the hill where he had meant once to take his own children, of his father, a hard, correct man who had never once in his life said a warm word and had died disappointed in a son who was, at the tide, the cavalry regiment, which had puzzled Corwin then did not puzzle him now, for he understood at last that his father had been a man made all of stone, unfinished grief piled on unfinished grief back through the generations, and that he, Corwin, had been well on the way to becoming such a man himself. A cold, correct stone duke who would have died disappointed in his own turn, had a clergyman's orphan not stumbled into his lap out of the dark and refused to leave him to his stone, and he learned her in turn. Learn that beneath the plain frank fearlessness there ran a vein of the tenderest feeling, kept quiet because she had learned young that the world does not reward a poor girl's tenderness. Learn that she wept easily over books and never over her own troubles. Learn that she was clever, far cleverer than her station had ever let her show, that she read the estate reports he left about and understood them, that she had opinions about drainage and rents and the price of wool that were shrewder than his steward's, and that she offered them shyly and defended them stoutly and was right more often than she was wrong. And Corwin, who had run Brancliffe alone from a chair for 3 years because he trusted no one, began, without quite deciding to run it with her. The two of them over the ledgers in the evenings, the seated duke and the standing companion, and the estate the better for it, and the men at the home farm beginning to say, that winter, that the old life was coming back to the great house, and no one able to say quite how. Save that the duke laughed now sometimes, and there was a young woman in it who was kind to the tenants and knew everyone's name. There came a thaw of a few days in early February, a false spring in the middle of the hard winter, when the snow drew back from the south lawns and the first snowdrops showed under the beeches, and Renner, who could not bear to see the duke shut up in the study while the sun was out, conspired with Halloway and the head keeper to have a broad low path of gravel raked and rolled smooth from the terrace door down across the near lawn to the old cedar, so that the chair might go out into the open air without being carried and without the wheels mirroring. And she presented it to Corwin one bright morning as a thing already done, so that he could not refuse it out of pride, and wheeled him out herself into the first sun he had felt on his face in 3 winters. He had not meant to be moved by it. He had trained himself against being moved by kindnesses, which had all, in 3 years, been kindnesses of the burying sort, but there was no burying in this. She did not push him gently as an invalid. She pushed him fast, laughing, down the smooth new path with the cold bright air stinging his face, and turned him under the cedar with a flourish, and said, "There, the estate of Brancliffe, all before you, and you out in it under your own sky for the first time since I have known you, and not a soul to see us but the deer, who are very discreet." And Corwin sat under the cedar in the February sun with the whole white and brown land rolling away before him, the frozen lake and the far hills and the smoke of the home farm rising straight up in the still air, and something in his chest that had been clenched for 3 years came, quietly a little open. "I used to ride all of this," he said, before he could stop himself, and braced for the pity. "It did not come." "I know," said Renner, sitting down on the cold stone bench beside the chair, tucking her cloak under her. "The head keeper told me. He said you had the best seat in the county and a hard hand and a soft heart for a green horse, and that the whole neighborhood turned out to watch you take the water jump at the point-to-point the spring before the war, and that you cleared it by a length and never touched leather. He tells it like scripture. All the old men do. They are prouder of you than you know, Corwin, and it is not a pity pride, it is the real kind, the kind men keep for one of their own who was the best at a thing. And do you know what I think when I hear them tell it? I do not think, poor Duke, how sad that he cannot ride. I think how fortunate the county was to have had a man among them who could do that, and how fortunate I am to have that man's soft heart for a green horse turned these days on me. You have not lost the thing that made you clear the water jump, Corwin. It was never in your legs. It was in the part of you that would not touch leather when a lesser man would have snatched at the reins. That part is not spoilt. I have seen it. It cleared a harder jump than any water, the night you let me build up your fire." Corwin looked out over the land a long while. "You have a way," he said at last, roughly, "of making a man feel he has been given back a thing he had spent 3 years learning to do without. It is a cruel gift, Renner, if you should ever take it away again." "I shall not take it away," she said. "You keep saying that, you keep waiting for me to be gone, like the others, in 11 days or a fortnight. I am not the others. The others came for £30 a year and left when the house frightened them. I came for £30 a year, it is true, and I have stayed for something the house cannot pay me, and cannot frighten out of me, and I will still be here, Corwin, when the deer have grown tame enough to eat from your hand, which the keeper says takes years of patience and gentleness and being always quietly there. I am good at being always quietly there. It is nearly the only thing I am good at. Let me be good at it for you. and that was the morning, though neither of them said it, that the thing between them stopped being a thaw and became a spring, and when a cloud came over and Renna wheeled him back up the smooth path to the house. Corwin found that for the first time in 3 years he was not thinking of what he had lost, but of what might yet be planted, and it was so strange and so long unfamiliar a direction for his thoughts to run that he sat with it, that afternoon. The way a man sits with a returned sensation in a limb he had thought forever numb, half in wonder and half in fear that it would fade, and it did not fade. The household had, by then, taken her wholly to its heart, and this was to matter more than Corwin knew, for when the county's scorn came down and the great world turned its edges toward her, it was the small world of Bruncliffe that closed quietly and stubbornly around her. The cook, a vast silent woman who had fed the Duke through 3 years of his black moods and privately blamed the whole world for them, took to sending up Miss Fairbairn's favourite dishes without being asked, and once, when a collar's lady's maid was overheard in the kitchen passage repeating a cruel word about the companion, was seen to advance upon the woman with a ladle, and a face of such terrible calm that the word was never repeated and the caller left early. The head keeper, who had a daughter Renna's age, took to touching his hat to her not as one touches it to an upper servant, but as one touches it to the mistress of the house, and instructed the underkeepers to do the same, so that a quiet countervailing report began to run out from Bruncliffe into the county from below, from the tenants and the cottagers and the market-day gossip, a report that said, whatever the fine people at Lady Markholt's said, that Miss Fairbairn was kind, and knew everyone's name, and had sat up 2 nights with the shepherd's wife in her fever when the fine people would not have crossed the yard, and that the Duke was a different and a better man since she came, and that anyone who called her an adventuress had best not do it within earshot of the home farm. Corwin heard of these things sidewise, as a master hears of the loyalties of his people, and they moved him more than the whole county's opinion either way. They are on your side, he told her, the ones whose side is worth having. The keeper, the cook who I did not know had a heart, having eaten her cooking for 35 years without meeting it. The tenants, my mother, who has not been on anyone's side but her own since my father died. And I will tell you a thing, Renna, that I have learned late, and at great cost. Those are the only sides that signify. A man spends his youth wishing to be admired by the drawing rooms, and his middle years being wounded by them, and if he is fortunate, and I have been more fortunate than I deserve, he learns before he dies that the drawing rooms never loved him and never will, and that all the love there ever was for him in the world was down in the kitchens and out at the home farm and in the faded rose room and in one plain grey-eyed woman on the floor by his fire, and that he was a fool not to have known it sooner. Let Lady Markholt keep her cards. I have Bruncliffe. I have, for the first time in my life, the whole of Bruncliffe, and I would not trade the cook's ladle for the whole of the county's good opinion, and I mean to marry you before the winter is out, and let the drawing rooms do their worst. The crest on the carriage door was the running hound of the Veres, and the man who stepped down from it, shaking the snow from a many-caped greatcoat, and looking up at the great grey front of Bruncliffe with the frank calculation of a man pricing a house, was Corwin's cousin and heir presumptive, Lucian Vere. Corwin watched him come from the study window and felt the old cold settle over the warmth of the winter like ice over the lake. Lucian was the son of the Duke's late uncle, a younger branch that had run to charm and debt in roughly equal measure. He was handsome in the smooth, unlined way of a man who has never carried anything heavier than his own reflection, and he was, Corwin knew to a certainty, waiting. He had been waiting 3 years. The surgeons had said Corwin would not live. And Lucian had come to Bruncliffe in his blacks with his measurements taken, and then Corwin had lived insultingly, obstinately, and Lucian had gone away to wait some more, and had come back at intervals ever since to inspect the property he confidently expected to inherit and to remind everyone, with a great show of family feeling, how sadly and how permanently his poor cousin was finished. A childless man in a chair cannot marry, cannot get heir, cannot last. The entail would come to Lucian, and Lucian, in the meantime, borrowed against the expectation, and lived beyond even that and grew each year a little more impatient with the length of Corwin's obstinate not dying. "Cousin," cried Lucian when Halloway had shown him in, "my dear fellow, you look, well, You look as you always do, which is a comfort, a great comfort. I feared the winter might have, but no, sound as a bell. How glad I am. He seated himself without being asked, spread his hands to the fire, and looked about the study with the proprietary ease of a man visiting the future. And how do you occupy yourself up here in all this snow? A man must go quite mad, I should think, with nothing but ledgers and one's own thoughts. I could not bear it. But then you were always the steady one, and I the wild. Different animals, cousin, different animals entirely. What do you want, Lucian? Said Corwin. Want? Can a man not visit his only cousin without? Lucian caught the Duke's flat eye and laughed, and abandoned the pretense with the ease of a man abandoning a coat he found too warm. Very well. Money. I want money, cousin, as I always want money, and as being the good and generous head of our house, you always give it me, though you scold me first, which I have learned to enjoy as one enjoys a cold plunge. 3,000 would set me quite right. 2, if you are hard. There is a small difficulty at Newmarket, a matter of a horse and a gentleman's word, and a man in my position so near that is to say, a man of my expectations must not be seen to be pressed. It reflects on the family. On the family, Corwin repeated. By which you mean it reflects on the estate you have already spent in your head. Lucian's smile did not waver, but something moved behind his eyes, cold and quick like a fish under ice. You wrong me, cousin, he said softly. You always did. I wish you nothing but long life, a very long life. It is only that the world will insist on being practical, and the world observes that you are, forgive me, I say it only because I love you, that you are not a marrying man now, and cannot be, and that there is no one after me, but a boy in the church. And so the world extends me a credit it would not extend to a better man, and I, being no better than I should be, take it. Where is the harm? You have no use for the money. You cannot spend it. You cannot. He gestured delicately at the chair, at the blanket, at the whole ruined lower half of his cousin's life. You cannot do the things a man buys with money, whereas he spread his hands, all warmth, all charm, all the appetite of a man for a life he has not yet been given. I can. For one white instant Corwin wanted, with a wanting that frightened him, to take up the poker and break his cousin's smiling face. It was the old rage, the rage that had kept him alive when the surgeons wanted to let him die, the rage that had become, in 3 years, the only muscle he still fully commanded. He had learned to spend it on servants and neighbours and his own reflection. He had never wanted so badly to spend it on a man's actual bone. He did not. He was the Duke of Brancliffe, and a duke does not brawl with a debtor in his own study. You shall have 2,000, Corwin said, in a voice like a shut door, on the usual note at the usual interest. And you shall be gone by Thursday, and you shall not, while you are under my roof, speak again of what I can and cannot do, or I shall find, cousin, a use for my money that will surprise you. I am not so finished as you have persuaded yourself. A man may sit in a chair and still hold the strings of 9,000 acres, and I hold yours. Remember it. And it was at that moment, at that precise moment, with the cold in the room and the fish moving under the ice of Lucian's eyes, and the poker unbroken in the Duke's white knuckles, that the study door opened and Rena Fairbairn came in with a book she thought might interest him, and stopped. She took in the room in a glance. Corwin saw her do it. He saw her see the visitor's fine coat and easy sprawl, and the Duke's white face and white hands, and the temperature of the air between them, and he watched her decide, in the space of a breath, not to retreat. I beg your pardon, she said. I did not know you had company, your grace. You will stay, said Corwin, before he had decided to say it. Miss Fairbairn, my cousin, Mr. Vere. He was leaving. Lucian was already on his feet, and Corwin, watching his cousin's face the way he had learned to watch a man who owed him money, saw a new thing arrive in it, saw Lucian look at the plain tall clergyman's daughter in her turned and mended gown, and dismiss her, and then sharply undismiss her. Saw him register that she had walked into the Duke's private study without knocking twice, that the Duke had bidden her stay, that the Duke's white rage had, at the sound of her voice, done something it had not done in 3 years and begun faintly, TBB. Your servant, Miss Fairbairn, Lucian said, and bowed over her hand with a warmth he had not shown his cousin, and his eyes, when they came up, were doing arithmetic. How fortunate my cousin is to have such company in all this snow. And you are the dowager's companion, sir, said Rena. The dowager's companion, Lucian, repeated and smiled, and the smile made Corwin want the poker again. Of course, how the house has improved. Well, cousin, I shall not keep you from your improvements. Thursday, you say. I shall be gone by Thursday. But I shall come again, cousin. I shall come often now. A man should look in on his family. One never knows. The fish surfaced and dove, how quickly things may change. He was gone by Thursday, with his £2,000 and his running hound carriage and a last long backward look at the front of the house, and Corwin, watching go, knew that he had made an error he could not now unmake. He had let Lucian see. He had let his cousin see that there was at Brancliff a thing the Duke valued, and a man who values nothing cannot be robbed, but a man who values one thing has given his enemies the map to his ruin. Who was that man, said Rena, that evening, when she came to the study as she had taken to doing, and found him staring into the fire? My heir, said Corwin, my cousin. The man who will have all of this when I am dead, and who would have it sooner if the getting were quiet enough not to hang him. Do not smile at him, Miss Fairbairn. Do not be alone with him. He is charming, and charm in a man who wants a thing is only appetite wearing gloves. He looked at you today the way he looks at the house, as a thing he might use to get what he wants. She was quiet a moment, then she said, And how do you look at me, your grace? Corwin turned his head sharply. She was standing by the window with the fire behind her, and her face was in shadow, and her voice had not been arch or flirting. It had been steady and grave, and only a little afraid, the voice of a person asking a question they have needed to ask and dreaded the answer to. And Corwin, who had a dozen cruelties ready, who could have shut the door on the whole warm, dangerous winter with a single well-placed truth, found that he could not say any of them, and could not answer either, and the silence stretched between them long and full and terrible, until at last he said, low and rough and honest for the first time in 3 years, I look at you, Miss Fairbairn, as at the one lit window in a house I thought was dark. And it is the cruelest thing that has been done to me since the wall came down, because I have no right to a window, and I know it, and I cannot stop looking, and when you go, and you will go, they all go, the dark will be worse than it ever was before you came, so do not ask me how I look at you. It is not a thing a man in my condition is permitted to say aloud, and it is not a kindness in you to make me feel it. The fire settled, the snow ticked at the black window, and Rena Fairbairn crossed the room, slowly, and stood before his chair, and looked down at him with her grey steady eyes gone bright, and said, It is not a kindness. You are right. It is not kind at all. It is only true. And I am done, your grace, with a world that lets us true things and calls it a sin to say them. I have felt this since a dark gallery and a loose stone, and a man who told me to mind the step, when he might have let me fall. Do not tell me what a man in your condition is permitted. Tell me what you want. I am not afraid of it. I have never once been afraid of it. I have only been afraid you would send me away before you said it. Corwin did not send her away. It cost him more to keep her there than she would ever know, cost him the labour of a lifetime's worth of learned refusal, the undoing of every wall he had built brick by bitter brick since the surgeons packed their bags. Every instinct he had trained in 3 years told him to be cruel now, quickly, cleanly, to say the finishing thing and watch her go and be safe again in the familiar dark. He knew the words. He could have said, You mistake a sick man's gratitude for something warmer. He could have said, I am not a man, Miss Fairbairn, I am the ruin of one, and you deserve the thing itself. He could have buried them both under the truth of the chair. It was there, ready, the poker of it in his hand. He looked at her instead, at her plain, frank, upturned face, at the fear in it and the courage over the fear, and he set the poker down. What I want, he said, and his voice was not steady, is not a thing I have let myself want since a field surgeon told me what I was. I want, God help me, I want the ordinary things. I want to hear your step in the passage and know it is coming to me. I want to argue with you about travel books and lose. I want to be a man you sit with because you wish to and not because you are paid £30 a year to sit with the household's misfortunes. I want. He stopped. His hands had closed on the arms of the chair. I want to be to one living person before I die, something other than a thing that happened. And you have made me want it, Miss Fairbairn, and it is the most dangerous kindness anyone has ever done me, and I do not know whether to bless you for it or curse you, and I have decided in this moment, looking at you, to do neither, and only to tell you the truth. Which is that the word would not come easily, it had rusted. He forced it, which is that I love you. There it is said, a duke in a chair loves his mother's companion. Laugh if you can bear to, half the county would. She did not laugh. She knelt, in her turned and mended gown, on the cold floor before his chair, so that her eyes were below his and looking up, and she took his hand, took it as no one had taken his hand in 3 years except to lift or to physic it, took it as one takes the hand of a person, warmly, wholly, for its own sake, and she pressed it. And she said, "Then we are 2 fools together, your grace, for I love you also, and have since the gallery, and I do not care a straw for the county, having never once been invited to it. Let them laugh. Let them all laugh. It will not warm them, and it will not cool us, and I would rather be laughed at with you than admired at by anyone else in England." And Corwin, the Duke of Brancliffe, whom the world had buried, who had not wept when the surgeons told him, who had not wept when Cassandra's letter came, who had made of his dry eyes a lost hard point of pride, bent his head over the plain hand holding his, and wept silently at last, and she let him, and did not once say, "There," or "It will be well," or any of the small lying comforts of the sick-room, but only held his hand and knelt on the cold floor, and let a proud man grieve in her keeping, for the first time, the whole of what he had lost, because to grieve it at last, in front of one person who would not look away, was the beginning, though neither of them knew the word for it yet, of getting some part of it back. It could not be secret. Nothing at Brancliffe was secret from Brancliffe. The servants knew within the week, knew that Miss Fairburn now took her supper on a tray in the Duke's study more evenings than not, that the Duke had ordered the study window seat re-cushioned though no one but she ever sat in it, that he had had the estate carpenter build, to his own quiet direction, a smooth ramp of oak over the 3 steps at the head of the east gallery so that his chair might reach the room, where she read to his mother without being carried, and that he now appeared there, of his own rolling, at 11 each morning, to sit and listen and, once, to laugh aloud at a foolish character in a novel, a sound so strange in the south apartments that a housemaid dropped a coal scuttle. The dowager knew too, and here Corwin had braced for war, and got instead, a thing that undid him worse than war. His mother said nothing for a fortnight. Then one afternoon, when Renner had gone up to fetch a shawl, the old woman looked at her son across the faded rose room and said, in a voice stripped suddenly of all its brittle brightness, "You are happy." "Mother." "Do not," said the dowager, and her chin trembled, and Corwin saw that she was weeping, this proud cold woman who had not wept in his presence since the day the news came from Spain. "Do not explain it to me, or excuse it, or ask my leave. I have watched you sit in the dark for 3 years and refuse every hand that reached for you, and I told myself it was your dignity. And it was not your dignity, it was your grief, and I could not reach it, because I could not bear to look at what you had lost, and so I talked to you of coal. God forgive me, I talked to my broken son of coal, because I was a coward, and she, that penniless girl, that clergyman's orphan I engaged to read me sermons, she was not a coward, she walked straight up to the thing I could not look at, and she loved it, she loved you. And she has given me back my son. She is not what I dreamed for you. She is 1,000 times better than what I dreamed for you. Marry her, Corwin. Marry her before the world can stop you, and let the world be damned." It was the finest thing his mother had ever said to him, and the last easy thing that happened at Brancliffe for a long while, because the world, as the world will, had already begun to move. Lucien came again in March as he had promised, and this time he was not alone. Down from the second carriage, in a pelisse of French trimmed with sable, and an air of injured graciousness, stepped Lady Cassandra, Cassandra Vere that had been, now Cassandra Hallowick these 2 years, the woman who had worn Corwin's ring and returned it, who had loved a whole and dancing duke and could not love a broken one, and who had married, Corwin now understood with a cold clarity, into the very family of the man who stood to inherit if the broken duke should die unawed and childless, Cassandra and Lucien, the jilt and the heir. They had found each other, these two, in the long patient business of waiting for Corwin to die, and they came to Brancliffe now arm in arm, all family feeling, all concern, and Corwin, watching them come, understood the shape of the danger at last and entire. For it was one thing for a childless invalid duke to sit in his chair and let his cousin borrow against the entail. That was a private arrangement and cost Lucien only patience. But a duke who meant to marry, a duke who might, however improbably, get an heir of his own body, that duke was no longer a patient man's certainty. That duke was a thief who meant to steal Lucien's expected inheritance out from under him by the outrageous, the unforgivable, the ungentlemanly expedient of not staying safely finished. "Cousin," said Lucien, warm as ever, taking both Corwin's hands in the hall, "you will forgive the surprise." Lady Cassandra was so distressed by the reports, the county talks of nothing else, and being an old and dear friend of the family, she could not rest until she had come herself to see how you did. "We are all so very concerned for you, cousin, all of us. It is only that we love you." And Cassandra came forward and looked at Rena, who stood at the foot of the stairs with a book under her arm, and looked her slowly up and down, the turned gown, the mended cuffs, the plain frank face, and then looked at Corwin in his chair, and said in a voice of the softest, sweetest, most poisonous compassion, so that every servant in the hall might hear it and carry it out into the county entire, "Oh, Corwin, my poor dear Corwin, what have they done to you? What has this person done to you? Everyone is saying it, and I would not believe it. I told them it was cruel to say it, and now I see it is true. A serving woman, a companion, in your condition. Corwin, my dear, you are not well, you cannot be thinking clearly. A man who has suffered as you have suffered is so terribly easy to work upon. She has seen a duke and a dukedom, and a poor helpless gentleman alone in a great house, and she has, oh, I cannot say it, it is too dreadful. But we are here now. Your family is here now, and we will not let you be robbed, dear Corwin, of the little that is left to you. We will not let this adventuress, take advantage of a broken man. The scorn of the county, when it came first not in a blow, but in an invitation. Lady Markholt, whose seat lay 6 miles east, and whose drawing-room was the true parliament of the neighbourhood, gave a card party in the 2nd week of March, and she sent a card to Brancliffe, to the Dowager, and to the Duke, and pointedly, deliberately, with a cruelty so polished it might almost pass for oversight, not to Miss Fairburn. Corwin turned the card over in his fingers and understood the whole of it at a glance. Cassandra had been at work. The county was being invited to take a side, and Lady Markholt, that great weathercock, had read the wind and set out refreshments for the fashionable opinion that the Duke of Brancliffe was being imposed upon by a scheming nobody, and that a right-thinking neighbourhood would rally, tenderly, to save him. "We shall not go," said Corwin. "You will go," said Rena, "and take your mother, and you will be seen, and you will be gracious, and you will give them nothing to feed on. If you refuse the card, they will say the adventuress has cut you off from your own friends, which is exactly the tale they wish to tell, and you will have written the last chapter of it for them. Play cards. Lose a little money to Lady Markholt, who cheats, and let her think she has won, and come home to me and tell me every wicked thing they said, and we shall laugh at it, and it will keep." She smiled, but her eyes were steady and a little grim. "I have been overlooked at better parties than Lady Markholt's, Corwin. I do not need to be inside the room. I need only for you to come home from it. Go and come home. That is all the victory I want this month." So the Duke of Brancliffe went to Lady Markholt's card party, for the first time in 3 years appearing in society, and had himself wheeled into the great warm chattering room, and watched the whole assembly turn to look at him, and then, in the manner of the polite, turn very carefully away, and he sat at the card tables and was gracious, and lost a little money to Lady Markholt, who cheated, and he endured with a shut face the elaborate compassionate nothings, the "my dear Duke, how very brave you are to come out," and the archer thrusts, the veiled inquiries after his health, his household, the dreadful reports one heard, which one did not of course believe, but which one felt one ought, as an old friend, to mention. And Cassandra was there, in another woman's drawing-room now, and could afford to be all sweetness, and came to his table and stood behind his chair with her hand almost upon it, and said, softly, for the table to hear, "I am so glad you have come out among your own kind again, Corwin. It is where you belong, not shut up in that great house with, well, I shall say no more, only that we who have loved you longest cannot bear to see you preyed upon. You will thank us in the end, you will see." And Corwin, who had come to give the county nothing to feed on, laid down his cards and looked up at her and said pleasantly, so that the whole table heard it, "You mistake the matter, Lady Cassandra, as you have mistaken it from the first. You imagine me shut up and preyed upon. But I was shut up long before Miss Fairbairn came, shut up by grief, and by the kindness of friends like yourself, who buried me so tenderly and so completely that I had near forgotten I was alive. It is not she who has shut me up, it is she who has let me out. You look at her and see a woman who has captured a duke. I look at her and see the only soul in 3 years who troubled to find out whether there was still a man inside the misfortune. You would none of you come near the misfortune. You sent cards to the dowager and left the duke to rot, all of you, for 3 years, and now that a penniless girl has done the work your Christian charity could not stomach, you discover a great tender concern for my welfare and call her a thief for having what none of you would touch. I find I've no more cards to play tonight. Lady Markholt, I thank you for a charming evening. Halloway." And he was wheeled out through the silent room, having said the one true thing at the one-card party, and the county buzzed over it for a fortnight, and it did not, in the short run, help him at all, for a county forgives a duke his grief and his wound and even his eccentric marriage, but it does not forgive being told, to its collective face, that it is a coward, and the scorn after Lady Markholt's hardened. It was then that they turned it upon Rena in earnest, and it was then that Corwin learned how much crueler the world is to the powerless woman than to the wounded man, for the wounded man they at least feared, and the powerless woman they did not. The tradespeople in the village grew cold to her. The milliner cut her, a subscription ball to which she had, briefly, in the first warm flush of the engagement, been invited, disinvited her by a note of exquisite regret. Anonymous unkindnesses arrived. A paper of village gossip left where she would find it, a cruel caricature slipped under a door, a servant's whispered word calculated to be overheard, and Corwin could not shield her from the half of it. For the cruelty was designed precisely to fall in the spaces where a man in a chair could not follow, the sewing-room, the village lane, the ladies' cloak-room, the whole soft underworld of feminine malice that Cassandra commanded as a general commands an army, and against which the Duke of Brancliffe, for all his 9,000 acres, was very nearly helpless. He raged against it in the privacy of his study, and Rena bore it and grew quiet, as has been told, and it was in the depth of that quiet, in the last cold week before the terrace, that Corwin understood the true and final peril, that they meant to make her leave. That every cruelty was aimed not at driving her out. She would not be driven, she had told him so. She had no home to be driven to and no fear left to be driven by, but at persuading her, slowly, patiently, that she was his ruin, at turning her love into her enemy, at making the best thing in her selflessness, into the lever that would pry her from him for his own sake. And he had seen it work upon her at the window, heard her say to the dark garden, "What am I to do then?" And he had forbidden it, and taken her hands and set the wedding for the Thursday se'nnight, and thought, help him, that he had won. He had not reckoned on his cousin. He had reckoned the danger to be all of Cassandra's kind, the soft slow poison of the drawing-room, the campaign of whispers meant to break a marriage before it was made. He had forgotten, a happy man forgets, that behind Cassandra stood Lucian, who was not a woman of the drawing-room, but a man of debts and appetites and a plain arithmetical stake in whether the Duke of Brancliffe lived to father and heir, and that a soft slow poison serves a woman who wishes only to prevent a marriage, but does not serve a man who needs, and needs quickly. Before the banns are read a third time for his cousin to die, Corwin, in the warmth of his winning, had watched the drawing-room door and forgotten the terrace door, and Lucian, who watched all the doors, had noticed it, and waited, and on a bright thawing morning in the last week of March had walked, smiling, out onto the terrace, above the rotting ice, where the lord of the manor and his bride sat happy above his lands with the break of the chair a thumb's breadth from a man's careless hand. The word adventurous hung in the great cold hall like smoke after a shot. Corwin felt the old white rage rise in him, clean and familiar, and for the space of a breath he let it come, because it was easier than the other thing rising under it, which was fear. The plain animal fear of a man who has just heard his enemy's name aloud and in his own house, the exact instrument by which they mean to take the one thing he has left. He did not shout. He had learned, in 3 years of holding 9,000 acres from a chair, that a man who cannot stand must never raise his voice, for the world takes a shout from a seated man as the flailing of the helpless. So he spoke instead very low and very level, and the hall went still to hear him, and it was Cassandra, for all her sable and her sweetness, who took an involuntary step back. "Lady Cassandra," said the Duke of Brancliffe, "you will not, in my house, speak so of a lady under my protection. You forfeited the right to concern yourself with my welfare on the day you returned my ring. I do not now reclaim it for you, nor grant you the standing to defend me from anything, least of all from my own happiness, which appears to distress you more than my ruin ever did. You called me, just now, a broken man easy to work upon. Let me relieve you. I am not easy to work upon. I was easy to work upon 3 years ago, when I was whole in body and could still be flattered and jilted and left. I am nothing of the kind now. Grief has made me exact, and pain has made me patient, and I see you, both of you, entirely. I see what you have come for. I see the sum of it, and you have made an error common to people who reckon a man by his legs. You have mistaken a duke who cannot walk for a duke who cannot think. Halloway. Show Lady Cassandra to the blue room. My cousin knows his own. They will not be staying past the week." They stayed laid longer than the week, for the March rains came and the roads went to ruin, and Brancliffe, which had been a warm drawn-in refuge all the winter, became a house with the enemy inside its walls. Corwin knew what they were about. He only could not always be everywhere to stop it. Lucian worked upon the servants, easy and generous, buying gossip with a shilling and a wink, gathering the small material of scandal. How long Miss Fairbairn stayed of an evening, how the Duke had ordered her window seat recushioned, how her supper went up on the study tray. Cassandra worked upon the county. She wrote letters. She received callers on the fine days. She wept prettily over the dreadful case of poor Corwin, so cruelly afflicted, now fallen prey in his helplessness to a fortune-hunting nobody. And she wept in such a way that the tale ran out from Brancliffe in every direction and came back magnified, so that within the fortnight the whole county knew that the mad Duke of Brancliffe, not content with being a cripple, meant now to disgrace his name by wedding a serving girl who had wormed her way into his sick room, and that his own family, poor souls, were fighting valiantly to save him from himself. Corwin bore the county's scorn as he had borne everything, with a shut face. He had lost the county already. He had told Renner so himself that first winter, that he had lost stretches of the road. What he could not bear, what came near in those grey and locked March weeks, to breaking the thing he had so lately and so painfully mended in himself, was to watch what the scorn did to her. For they were cruel to Renner in the way the world is cruel to the powerless, which is quietly and deniably, and without any single blow a person might name. Cassandra was all sweetness to her face and poison behind her back. Lucian was gallant to her in the halls in a way calculated to be seen and misconstrued, so that the gallantry itself became a slander. The servants, who had loved her, grew uncertain under the weight of the county's certainty, and some of them cooled. Callers who came on the fine days looked through her as through a window pane, or worse, looked at her with the pity that is contempt reserved for a woman thought to have sold herself. And Renner, who had walked into a dark gallery afraid of nothing, who had faced down the dowager's tempers and the Duke's cruelties without flinching, began, Corwin saw it, and it was a knife in him, began to grow quiet. Not defeated, she was never defeated, but quiet and careful and watchful, a woman learning to move through a house that had turned its edges toward her. And one evening he found her at the study window with her cheek against the cold glass and her eyes red, and she did not hear him come, and he heard her say, very low, to the dark garden, to herself, not knowing he was there, "I would not mind it for myself. I have been overlooked my whole life. It is an old coat and it fits. But they say it hurts him. They say a wife like me would finish him in the county. And what if it is true? What if I love him, and the loving him is the very thing that pulls the lost of the world down onto his head? What then? What am I to do then?" And Corwin understood that this was the true shape of the danger, deeper and crueler than any letter of Cassandra's. They did not need to drive Renner out. They needed only to persuade her that her love was his ruin, to turn her own courage, her own selflessness, the very best of her, into the weapon that would make her leave him for his sake. It was a subtler and a surer poison than scandal, and Cassandra, who understood the self-sacrifice of good women, because she had none of it herself and had watched it in others all her life, had aimed it with terrible accuracy. "You will do nothing," said Corwin from the doorway, and Rena turned, and did not trouble to hide her wet face, which was one of the things he loved in her. "You will not leave to save me, Rena. I forbid. Do you hear? It is the one thing. I have borne the surgeons and the jilting and the chair and the county and my cousin. I have borne all of it, and I will bear the rest. But I will not bear that. If you leave me for my own good, I shall not thank you for it. I shall know it for what it is, the last and cleverest thing they did to me, and I shall grieve you not as a man grieves a love that failed, but as a man grieves a love that was murdered by kindness. Do not let them use your goodness to do what their malice could not. Marry me. Marry me now this month before the roads open and the world can gather itself. Let it be done, and then there will be nothing for them to prevent, and nothing for you to sacrifice, and we will face the county as we face everything else, together, and unafraid. And let them talk until they weary of it, for they will, Rena, they always do. The world has a short memory for other people's happiness, and we need only outlast it." She came to him then and knelt again as she had knelt the first time, and took his hands and said yes, and it should have been the end of the danger. It was the beginning of the worst of it, for Lucian Vere, watching from the Blue Room's window as the estate carpenter and the rector's man came and went, hearing from a bought footman that the banns were to be read and a licence sent for, understood at last that his patient waiting was over. That broken cousin he had counted on to die quietly, and childless meant instead to marry, and to live, and God forbid, to breed, and that every year of Corwin's obstinate not dying now threatened to father, upon a healthy young wife, and heir who would put Lucian Vere and his French debts out of the succession forever, and Lucian, who was charming and idle, and deep in debt, and had until this moment merely intended to inherit, found rising in himself, in the dark of the Blue Room, a colder and simpler intention, that a man who will not die on his own may, in a house full of the accidents that befall the infirm, be helped. He did not phrase it so to himself, even in the privacy of his own mind. Men of Lucian's kind never do. They think in griefs foreseen and misfortunes it would be foolish not to prepare for. But he began, from that night, to observe his cousin with a new and studious attention. The chair at the head of the oak ramp Corwin had built to reach the gallery, the great tester bed and the strength it took Halloway to lift the Duke into it, the terrace above the frozen lake where Corwin liked, on the clear cold afternoons, to have himself wheeled to look at the water and the far white hills, the low stone balustrade, the ice below beginning, in the March thaw, to rot and blacken at its edges. He observed, and he waited, and he wrote a careful letter to a careful man in London about the exact wording of an entail and the exact status of a marriage not yet solemnized and a child not yet, and perhaps now never to be, conceived. Corwin knew none of this. Corwin, for the first time in 3 years, was happy, and a happy man watches the doors less carefully than a bitter one, and this too Lucian had counted upon. The thaw came in earnest in the last week of March, and with it the day that Corwin would remember ever after as the day he learned what was left in him. It began well, which is how such days begin. The banns had been read twice, the licence had come. The wedding was set for the Thursday se'nnight, a small thing in the estate chapel, the rector and the household and his mother in her best grey and Rena in a gown the dowager had insisted on giving her, a soft dove-coloured silk being made up in the sewing-room with a tenderness the old woman would not have owned to. The sun came out for the first time in a month, and Rena, coming to the study with the morning's letters, found the Duke restless in his chair and said, "Come out. The sun is out and the lake is beautiful, and you have not been on the terrace in a fortnight. Come and look at the water with me before it clouds again." So Halloway wheeled the chair out onto the long stone terrace that ran above the lake, and set the brake. And Corwin sent him in for the shawls the dowager insisted upon, and for a few minutes the Duke of Brancliffe and the woman he was to marry sat alone above the wide bright thawing lake with the far hills white behind it, and were simply happy. In the plain unremarkable way that Corwin had thought forever closed to him and had lately learned was the whole and entire point of being alive. After Thursday, Rena said, "I mean to take you everywhere, to the far woods and the trout stream, and up to the folly on the hill." The head keeper says the track can be made smooth enough for the chair with a day's work, and I have asked him to do it, and he will, because he likes you, whatever you think. And he told me the men at the home farm all say the estate has not been so well run in 40 years, and that a man who can do that from a chair is worth 10 who could do it from a horse. I only tell you so you will know it. You think the world sees the chair. Some of the world does. But the ones who matter see the man in it, and there are more of them than you allow. Corwin took her hand. He was about to answer her. He had no bitter thing ready, only a warm one, when he heard, behind them on the terrace, a step that was not Holloway's. It was Lucian. Afterward, Corwin would go over it 100 times and never be able to say what warned him. Perhaps it was that Lucian was where Lucian should not have been, out on the terrace alone with no reason, in his greatcoat at mid-morning. Perhaps it was the particular quality of his cousin's smile, which was warm as ever and which had, that morning, something behind it that had come all the way up from under the ice at last. Perhaps it was only that a man who has lived 3 years watching for the small, precise cruelty in others' faces learns to read the largest cruelty when at last it shows itself. "Cousin," said Lucian, pleasant, coming along the balustrade toward the chair, toward the break, toward the low stone edge and the rotten, blackening ice 30 feet below. "What a picture! The lord of the manor and his bride, above his lands. I could not resist." "Miss Fairburn, forgive me. Might I beg a moment with my cousin? Family matters. Before the wedding, it will not take long." And Corwin looked at the break of his own chair, and at the low balustrade a yard behind it, and at the ice, and at his cousin's hand already reaching casual, brotherly, for the back of the chair, a helpful hand, a hand any witness would swear was only steadying a poor invalid's chair, a hand that had only to release the brake and lean once, on the slope of the old worn terrace stones that ran, Corwin now saw as if for the first time, ever so slightly, down toward the edge, and the Duke of Brancliffe understood, wholly and coldly and without any possibility of doubt, that his cousin had come to kill him, and to make it look like the sort of accident that befalls the infirm, and that Rena was standing between the chair and the balustrade, in the path of it, and that if the chair went over the edge in a struggle she would very likely go with it, and that this too would suit Lucian, who needed both the Duke dead and the marriage prevented, and to whom, at the bottom of the rotten March ice, one body or two made no great difference. There was no time to cry out. There was no time to reason. There was only Lucian's hand closing on the chair, and the brake giving under his thumb, and the small terrible first lurch of the wheels toward the edge, toward Rena, who had half turned, who did not yet understand, whose eyes were only beginning to widen. And the Duke of Brancliffe rose. He would never afterward be able to explain it, and he stopped, in time, trying. The surgeons had said the spine was crushed, the nerves severed, the thing beyond mending, and they had been right, in the main, for 3 years, and it is true that a man whose legs are dead does not, cannot, by any wish however fierce, make them live. But it is also true that the body of a strong man carries buried in it more than the surgeon's books account for, that the great cavalry frame that had hauled itself from bed to chair 10,000 times had built, in 3 years of that hauling, an iron strength through shoulder and arm and back, and yes, through the ruined legs a last faint mutinous flicker of feeling that Corwin had felt come and go for months, and never dared to trust or tell. And it is true above all, that there is in the human animal, at the last edge, with the one beloved thing in the world a half-second from death, a reservoir of will that is not measured by any physician and that pours itself, all at once, into whatever remains. Corwin got his hands to the arms of the chair, and he threw the whole of himself, the iron shoulders, the mutinous flicker, the 3 years of rage now turned at last to a single purpose, up and out of the chair and against his cousin, and for one impossible tearing instant the Duke of Brancliffe stood. He stood, on legs that shrieked and buckled and could not, hold him more than the space of a heartbeat. But for that heartbeat they held, they answered, they bore his weight and his fury, and he took that single reeling, agonized, upright stride and drove his cousin backward off the chair, away from Rena, away from the edge, so that it was Lucian, not the chair and not the woman, who went staggering into the low balustrade with the Duke's whole weight upon him. The stone caught Lucian across the hips. He cried out. For one instant the 2 men hung there together on the very lip of the terrace. the standing duke and the falling heir, above the 30-foot drop and the rotten ice. And then Corwin's dead legs gave entirely, and he went down, and his falling weight, which had carried them both to the edge, now dragged them both back from it. The two cousins collapsing together in a tangle onto the safe stone of the terrace a foot short of the drop, as Renna's scream finally tore loose and Holloway came running with the shawls flying and the second footman behind him, and the thing was over in less time than it takes to tell. And the Duke of Brantcliffe lay on the cold flags of his own terrace, with his ruined legs blazing beneath him, and his cousin pinned and gasping under his arm, and the woman he loved alive, 3 feet away and alive. He tried to. Lucian was gabbling. Cousin, it was an accident. The break, I only meant to steady the, you are mad, you are all mad, take him off me, I am injured, I am. You are finished, said Corwin. He said it from the ground on his back in agony, unable to rise again by so much as an inch, having spent in that one impossible standing stride the whole of a strength he might never summon so again. And it did not matter at all, because he had spent it on the one thing worth the spending. And every soul on that terrace had seen him do it. Holloway had seen it. The footman had seen it. Renna, white and shaking and on her knees now beside him with his head gathered against her, had seen it. The Duke of Brantcliffe, the man they said would never rise again, had risen, had stood on his dead legs for a single searing heartbeat, and had used it not to walk, not to dance, not for any of the things the county pitied him for losing, but to put his own body between the woman he loved and the man who meant to kill her. Holloway, said Corwin, when he could speak, send James on the fast horse for the magistrate and for the constable, and let my cousin be locked in the blue room with 2 men at the door until they come. He released the brake of my chair with intent to send it, and Miss Fairbairn with it, over the edge onto the ice. There are 3 witnesses, I am one, and search his rooms and his papers, and the letters he has had from London these 3 weeks, and you will find the rest of it, the wording of the entail, the reckoning of what my death would be worth to him, the whole cold sum. Go. In the first hours after the terrace, before the fever took him, Corwin lay on his bed with his ruined legs blazing, and would not let them give him the physician's draught until he had seen it done, had seen his cousin bestowed under guard in the blue room, had seen the letters brought to him, had dictated to Renna, whose hand shook but whose voice did not, the plain account of the thing that would go to the magistrate. And it was only when the last of it was in train, when he knew that Lucian could not slip away in the confusion, and that the record was made and witnessed and safe, that he let them dose him and let the dark come, and his last thought as it came was not of the pain, nor of the trial, nor of his cousin, but of the half-second on the terrace when his dead legs had answered him, and he carried that thought down into the fever like a coin closed in the fist. The impossible fact of it, I stood. I did not think I could, and I did, and she is alive because I did, and whatever else is taken from me they cannot take that. It happened. I stood. Renna did not leave his room through the 3 days of the fever. She would not be sent to rest. She sat by the bed and cooled his brow, and he raved, for he raved. In the fever of the smoke and the wall and the horse coming down, she held his hand and spoke to him low and steady until the raving eased, and it was her voice, the servants said, and not the physician's draughts, that brought him through. And when at last the fever broke, near dawn on the 4th day, and Corwin opened his eyes clear for the first time, the first thing he saw was her face, grey-eyed and hollow with sleeplessness and lit with a relief so plain and so total that it undid him. And he said, before he had strength for anything else, you are alive, and she said, so are you, and neither of them could say anything more for a while, and did not need to. The magistrate's business went forward with a speed that surprised the county and did not surprise Corwin, for a duke's word carries weight even from a bed, and 3 witnesses of good character are 3 witnesses, and the letters, once read, admitted of only one reading. Lucian's careful man of business came down from London, and looked at the case and looked at his client and made, on his client's behalf, the only bargain a sensible man could make. A full and witnessed renunciation of every claim upon Brantcliffe in exchange for the Duke's forbearing to press the charge that would have hanged him. Corwin took the bargain, not out of family feeling, he had none left for Lucian, but because a public trial would have dragged Renner's name through every newspaper in England, and because a hanged cousin is a heavier thing to carry through a marriage than a banished one, and because, at the bottom of it, he found he did not want his happiness founded on a scaffold, even a deserved one. So Lucien Vere signed away his expectations before witnesses, white and shaking and full of a rage he dared not speak, and was put aboard a ship, and passed out of the story, and Cassandra, seeing the wind change, had already fled. And the two who had schemed together over the long patient death of a wounded man found at the end that they had between them succeeded only in giving that man back his life, his standing in the county, and the wife they had tried to cost him, which is the usual harvest of such schemes, though the schemers never believe it until they reap it. The county's turning, when it came, was swift and shameless and complete, as has been told, and Corwin watched it with a dry amusement that had, at last, no bitterness left in it. The very ladies who had cut Renner at the milliner's now vied to call at Brancliffe. Lady Markholt herself sent a card, and a basket, and a note of the most fulsome and forgetful warmth, and the subscription ball that had disinvited the companion wrote, with exquisite regret for a clerical error, to beg the future Duchess of Brancliffe to honour it with her presence. Renner read these effusions aloud to Corwin in the evenings in a dry, level voice that made him laugh until his ribs ached, and they answered them all with a stately graciousness that gave nothing away and forgot nothing, and accepted a few and declined more, and went, together, that spring once to Lady Markholt's, where the Duke of Brancliffe was wheeled into the great warm room that had turned its back on him, and where, this time, the whole assembly actually rose, the men to their feet and the ladies from their chairs, as the wounded Duke came in with his plain grey-eyed Duchess-to-be at his side, and Corwin understood that he was being applauded now for the very thing he had been pitied for before, that the county had not changed one particle, that it was the same weathercock it had always been, and that the only difference was the wind, and he was not fooled by it for an instant, and he bowed to it graciously, and lost a little money to Lady Markholt, who still cheated, and came home to Renner, who was the only true thing in the whole bright false room, and told her every word of it, and they laughed as she had promised that first grim March that they would. You were right. He sat night in the study, with the spring rain soft on the windows and the wedding 4 days off. You said that day that the only victory you wanted was for me to come home from the party. I have come home from the party, from every party. I mean never to be at home anywhere again but where you are, Renner, which is a strange fate for a man who once cleared the water jump before the whole county and thought a full life was measured in acres and horses and the admiration of drawing-rooms. I have all the acres still, and no horses, and the admiration has come back like a bad shilling, and I find I care for exactly none of it, and for you entirely, and I think that if the wall had not come down I should have gone through my whole life a cold correct stone duke like my father, admired and unloved and never once knowing the difference. It is a terrible thing to say, and I say it to you because you are the one person who will not misunderstand it. I would not undo the war. I would not undo the wall, nor the horse, nor the chair, nor the 3 years in the dark. Because at the end of all of it, in a gallery in the dark, on a loose stone there was you, and a whole and unwounded man would have ridden past you in the road and never seen you, and I would rather be the broken man who saw you than the whole man who did not. There. Now you know the last and strangest truth of me. Marry me on Thursday, and I shall spend the rest of my life proving I meant it. They carried the Duke of Brancliffe to his bed, and the physician came, and for 3 days Corwin lay in a fever of pain from the thing he had done to himself, and did not regret one instant of it. The magistrate came and heard the 3 witnesses and searched the blue room, and found the London letters folded in the lining of a portmanteau, the correspondence with a discreet man of business about the precise value of the entail, about whether a marriage, yet unsolemnized, could be set aside, about the survivorship of estates and the great difference to a man's expectations between a childless cousin who lived and a childless cousin who did not. It was not quite a confession of murder. Lucien had been too careful for that, all his life, in everything but the single unconsidered instant on the terrace when he had reached for the brake in front of 3 pairs of eyes. But it was enough. It was more than enough. A gentleman may survive a great deal in the county's estimation, but he cannot survive being taken in the act of tipping his crippled cousin off a terrace to death, before witnesses for money, and the letters made plain that the act had a history, and a purpose, and a price. Lucien Vere was committed for trial. He did not stand it in the end, his careful man of business, seeing which way the wind blew and disliking the smell of the rope, negotiated on his behalf a quiet ruin in place of a loud one, a full renunciation, under the hand of witnesses, of every claim and expectation upon the Brancliffe estate, present or reversionary, in exchange for the Duke's forbearance from pressing the capital charge, and a passage on a ship to the Canadas, whither Mr. Lucien Vere removed himself with his debts and his charm and his French tailoring, and where the record does not follow him, save to note that a man who has learned nothing rarely prospers among strangers, and Lucien had learned nothing at all. Cassandra did not wait for the trial. Cassandra was gone from Brancliffe within a day of the terrace, in her sable pelisse, in her fine carriage, with a face like a slammed door, gone back to her Mr. Haylowicke and her place in the world, having discovered that a scandal she had helped to author had turned, overnight, into a scandal that touched her. For the county which had so lately clucked over poor mad Corwin and his adventuress now had a far better tale to tell, the tale of the wicked heir and the beautiful heartless jilt, who had schemed together to murder a war-wounded duke on his own terrace for his money, and had been foiled. And here the tale reached the part the county loved best and would tell for a generation, foiled by the crippled duke himself, who had risen from his chair, risen on his dead soldier's legs, to shield the humble good girl they had all so shamefully misjudged. For the county turned. County always turns. It is the one thing that may be relied upon in a county, that it will run in a body toward whatever it can most enjoy admiring, having exhausted the pleasures of whatever it was lately enjoying despising. And there is nothing a county enjoys so much as a love it can pretend it foresaw. Within the month, the callers who had looked through Rena Fairburn came back with different faces. The ladies who had wept over poor Corwin now wept, more becomingly, over the beautiful courage of it. The wounded hero and the faithful girl, and the plain frank clergyman's orphan whom the county had called an adventuress found herself, before a single vow was spoken, transformed by the county's short and self-serving memory into the future Duchess of Brancliffe, and treated accordingly, which she bore with exactly the same level grey-eyed steadiness with which she had borne the scorn, being a woman not much moved by the county in either of its humours. "They are all so kind now," she said to Corwin, sitting in the window seat of his bedchamber where he lay recovering, the dove silk of her unworn wedding gown hanging finished on the door. "It is quite dizzying. Mrs. Ashcombe, who cut me in the milliner's not 3 weeks since, sent up a whole basket of hothouse grapes and a note calling me her dear brave girl. I did not know I was her dear brave girl. I do not think she knew it either, until it became fashionable. Eat the grapes," said Corwin. "Do not eat the note. That is the whole of the wisdom I have gathered concerning the county in 35 years, and I make you a present of it. They will love you now as thoroughly as they despised you, and it means precisely as little either way. And the only souls in the world whose regard is worth the weighing are the ones who came to you in the dark of the winter, when there was nothing in it for them, my mother, and Halloway, and the head keeper, and the men at the home farm, and one other." He took her hand. "I forget his name. A sole fellow in a chair. You may have heard of him. The county says he is much improved. They were married on a morning in April, in the estate chapel, with the doors open to the smell of the thawed earth and the first green coming on the beeches. Corwin came to it in his chair, and was lifted by Halloway and the head keeper, up the 2 shoe-shallow steps to the altar rail, and this, the being lifted, the plain fact of the chair at the altar of his own wedding, he had dreaded for weeks as the last humiliation, the thing that would sit like a shadow at the edge of the day. And it did not. It did not sit there at all, for he had learned on the terrace, the thing that 3 years of bitterness had hidden from him, that the chair was not the truth of him. The truth of him was what he had spent his one impossible standing stride upon. A man is not the legs he has lost. A man is the thing he would give the last of his strength to protect. And Corwin, waiting at the altar rail in his chair, while the doors stood open to the spring, had no shadow on him at all, because he knew at last, entirely and forever, what he was, and it was not a broken thing, and it never had been. Rena came up the short aisle in the dove-grey silk with the dowager's pearls at her throat, and she did not come slowly, and she did not come sadly, and she did not once glance down at the chair as though it were a grief to be got past. She came the way she walked everywhere, quick and glad, and as though she had somewhere to be and was glad of it, and the place she had to be was there at his side, and she reached it, and knelt beside his chair so that her eyes were level with his, and took his hand, and the rector, who had known Corwin since he was a boy on a pony, and had buried his father, and had privately given the whole matter up for lost these 3 years, married them so, the standing bride kneeling and the seated groom, in a manner no book of etiquette provided for and no one present ever forgot. The physician, who was a younger man than the surgeons of the war and had read newer books, told Corwin afterward, carefully not to hope too much, and then less carefully not to despair too much either. What happened on the terrace, he said, was not a miracle and not a cure. The great injury remained. The Duke would live and die a man who could not walk. But the flicker of feeling Corwin had felt come and go, the mutinous last spark that had answered him for one heartbeat at the edge. That was real, the physician said, and worth the tending. There were exercises, and there were braces and irons a clever man in London had lately devised, and there were men, a very few, who by years of labour and pain had won back from such injuries not the full use of their legs, but some small hard-earned portion of it, a standing where there had been none, a step or two on irons and a strong arm. Where there had been nothing, he would not promise it. He would only say it was not, as the old surgeons had sworn, impossible, that impossible was a word doctors used to save themselves the labour of hope, and that a man who had once, at the last edge, stood, might, with years and will and someone to stand for, learn to stand again. Corwin took the labour up, not for the county, who would have made a spectacle of it, and not even for it himself. He took it up in the long ordinary years that followed, because there came a morning, and this the story may tell, having promised to render it tenderly, when a small hand tugged at the arm of his chair, and a small voice, that had his mother's stubbornness in it and Rena's frank grey eyes above it, demanded to be lifted up to see the deer under the beeches, and the Duke of Brancliffe, who had been told he would never rise, set the irons to his legs that the London man had made, and took his wife's arm on the one side and the chair back on the other, and rose, slowly and by degrees, and with a pain he had long since made his peace, to his full commanding height, and stood, and lifted the small tugging person up against his shoulder to see the deer, and stood there a long moment in the morning light upright, holding what he loved, while Rena steadied his arm and did not weep, because she had learned long ago that he did not want weeping, he wanted only to be seen. And she saw him, she had always seen him, from the first dark gallery and the loose stone she had found with her ankle, and Corwin, standing, looking out over the thawed green land that was his and the deer beneath the beeches and the family he had been told he would never have, understood that the rising the surgeons had denied him and the county had pitied and his enemies had reckoned on was, after all, the least of the risings that had been asked of him, that the hard one, the true one, the one no injury could prevent and no man could do for him, had been the rising up out of the grave of his own bitterness into the play light of loving and being loved, and that this rising he had managed, in the end, only because one penniless, plain, frank, fearless young woman had stumbled into the dark where he lay buried, and lit 2 candles, and looked at him and refused from that hour to this to look away. The years that followed were long and mostly quiet, and this the story may tell more briefly, for happiness, as Corwin himself once observed to his wife, makes a poor tale and a good life, and they had at last swapped the one for the other and never regretted the exchange. He kept to the labour the London physician had shown him, through years of it, in the private mornings before the house was up, with no witness but Rena and, later, the small stubborn person who liked to be lifted to see the deer. It was hard, and it was slow, and it was not, ever, a cure. The great injury remained. There were days the legs would give him nothing and days the old pain returned like a bad tenant, and he kept to the chair, and was short-tempered, and Rena left him alone until it passed, having learned the weather of him as he had once learned the weather of her. But by degrees, over years, the mutinous flicker became a mutinous strength. The irons the London man had made became, with practice, a thing he could set to himself, and there came to be, in the ordinary run of his days, moments when the Duke of Brancliffe stood to greet an honoured guest, to give his arm to his wife across a room, to stand at the font when the rector held his firstborn, and to stand, most often, at the window in the mornings with a small tugging person hoisted against his shoulder to count the deer beneath the beeches. He never walked as other men walked. He never danced. The county's pity had been right about the letter of the thing and wrong entirely and forever about the heart of it. He had lost the use of his legs, and he had not lost the use of himself, and he came in time to understand that these were two quite different losses, and that the world in its haste habitually confused them and buried men who were only wounded, and that he had very nearly let it bury him. The dowager lived to see her grandchildren and grew, in her last years, almost soft, and was heard to say, more than once to whatever caller would listen, that her son had married the wisest and kindest woman in England, and that she had chosen herself, engaged her personally, seen the quality in her at a glance, which was not quite how it happened, but Corwin never corrected her, for the old woman had earned her small revisions, having in the event loved Rena better than she had ever managed to say. She died in her sleep in the faded rose room, with her son's hand in hers, and the nest that Rena had set on her windowsill that first winter still there on the sill, kept these many years, and Corwin, who had once thought he would not weep again as long as he lived, wept for her cleanly and was grateful that he could. Holloway lived on and grew very old in the service, and was there at the end of the story as he had been there at the beginning, and the last we shall say of him is that he was heard one morning watching the Duke rise on his irons to lift a laughing child to the window, to murmur to no one in particular, in the voice of a man who has served two masters in one body and lived to see the better one come home, "It is good, Master Corwin, it is good to see you stand." And the Duke, without turning, said, "Holloway, do not grow sentimental." And the old man said, "No, your grace," and went out smiling, and neither of them was fooled. As for the county, it did what counties do. It forgot that it had ever been cruel, and remembered instead that it had always, of course, admired the brave Duke and his devoted Duchess, and it told the tale of the terrace to its children and its children's children, improving it a little each generation, until in time the story of how the wounded Duke of Brancliffe from his chair to shield the humble girl he loved from the wicked heir who meant to murder them both passed out of memory, and into the sort of thing the neighbourhood said had happened once long ago, at the great house, though no one could quite say when, or to whom, or whether it was true. And it was true. Every word of it was true, though the county never deserved it, and Corwin, in his later years, when some earnest young curate or wide visitor would ask him whether the tale of the terrace was to be believed, would only smile and glance at his wife across the room and say, "You must ask the Duchess. She was there. She had, I recall, only lately found the loose stone with her ankle." And Rena, Duchess of Brancliffe, who had come to the great house on the mail in the rain with £11 4 and no home to go to, and had stumbled in the dark into the lap of a world had buried alive, and had lit him 2 candles and looked at him, and stayed. Rena would set down her book and cross the room to her husband's chair, quick and glad and as though she had somewhere to be, and take his hand and say, "It is true, every word. I was overlooked my whole life, sir, until one dark night I fell into the lap of the only man in England who ever troubled to see me, and the man they all said would never, rose and stood for me and has been standing for me in every way that matters ever since. So yes, you may believe it. It is the truest thing I know." And the Duke of Brancliffe would lift her hand to his lips and look at her the way he had looked at her from the first, as at the one lit window in a house he had thought was dark forever, and be, in the plain ordinary daylight of the life they had built between them, the seated man and the standing woman, the wounded Duke and the fearless orphan, the happiest man in England, which he had once believed a thing forever closed to him, and had learned, in the end, was only ever waiting in the dark for someone unafraid enough to come in and light the candles and stay.